blood in the water wasn't a rare sight out on the Dakota plains. A careless deer, a coyote's midnight hunt, the Whispering Creek carried all manner of life and death. But the blood clinging to a man, a Lakota warrior with an eagle feather woven into his dark hair, was different. For Abigail Monroe, a girl who knew the land better than she knew most people, this was a secret the river had given her alone. One that would cost her. She had no way of knowing that her act of mercy had lit a fuse that would burn for 3 short nights before bringing the fire and fury of hired guns right to her door. The afternoon sun of late summer beat down on the Dakota Territory, turning the air into a shimmering haze that danced above the tall prairie grass. Abigail Monroe, her face shaded by a worn straw hat, traced the winding path of the Whispering Creek. Her chore was simple: check the fence line. Where it met the water, a constant battle against erosion and thirsty cattle. The work was familiar, the solitude a welcome balm. Here, away from the stern, worried gaze of her father, Silas, and the restless energy of her younger brother, Daniel, the world felt simpler. It was just her, the land, and the steady murmur of the creek. That was why the discordance of the scene struck her so deeply. A snag of driftwood near the opposite bank, unusual in its size and shape, had caught a tangle of buck skin. But it was the unnatural stillness of it, and the dark crimson cloud that bloomed sluggishly in the clear water around it, that made her heart hammer against her ribs. She waded into the cool current, her worn leather boots sinking into the soft silt her skirt held high. As she drew closer, the driftwood resolved into a human form, face down in the shallows. A man. His bare back was a canvas of muscle and scars, old and new. A gash, deep and ugly, ran along his side, the source of the bleeding. A single eagle feather, its white and black tip stark against his wet dark hair, told her who he was. Lakota. A man from the people her father spoke of, only in low, cautious tones, a people being squeezed by settlers, prospectors, and the unyielding march of the railroad. Fear sharp and instinctual coiled in her gut. Every story she'd ever heard warned her to turn back, to run to the homestead and tell her father, to let the river claim what it had found. But then a sound. A soft guttural groan, a breath that was more of a struggle than a sign of life. He was alive. Abigail's fear warred with a deeper, more stubborn part of her nature, a compassion forged from mending the broken legs of lambs and nursing sick calves back from the brink. She couldn't leave him. Hefting his dead weight was a monumental task. He was taller than her father, his frame solid with a life lived on the move. She strained her muscles, screaming in protest, and finally managed to drag him onto the grassy bank. He lay limp, his face turned to the side features, strong and sharp, even under a sheen of mud and pain. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged bursts. The gash in his side was worse than she'd thought, a wicked cut that looked like it had been made by a Bowie knife. It was clean, brutally so, not the work of a fall or an animal. This was a man's doing. Panic gave way to a cold, clear focus. She couldn't take him to the homestead. Her father, Silas, was a practical man, not a cruel one, but his pragmatism was carved from fear. He saw the Lakota not as men, but as a threat to their fragile existence, a storm gathering on the horizon. Bringing a wounded warrior into his home would be in his eyes, inviting the lightning to strike. There was only one other place. An old line cabin, nestled in a thicket of cottonwoods, a mile up creek from their property. It was abandoned years ago, left to rot by a trapper who had vanished into the territory's vastness. It was secluded, forgotten. Perfect. She ran back to the farmhouse, her mind racing. She moved with practiced stealth, grabbing a canvas tarp from the barn, a small tin of her mother's healing salve, and a canteen of fresh water. Daniel was out checking snares to the east, and her father was mending a harness in the barn's far corner. Neither saw her slip away. The return journey was a grueling ordeal. Using the tarp as a makeshift travois, she pulled the warrior's unconscious body over the rough terrain, her footsteps erased by the tall grass. Every rustle of leaves, every cry of a distant hawk sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She was breaking every rule, written and unwritten, that governed her world. She was hiding a man who, to many, was the enemy. By the time she reached the dilapidated cabin, sweat soaked her dress, and her arms felt like lead. The structure was little more than a pile of decaying logs, with a semblance of a roof, but it offered shelter. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. She eased him onto the dirt floor, his head resting on a bundled patch of old sacking. As she worked, she saw the full extent of his injuries. Beyond the knife wound, his body was a map of bruises. His knuckles were raw and split, as if he'd put up a fierce fight. Tucked into a small leather pouch at his belt, miraculously still attached, was a bundle wrapped in hide and tied with intricate knots. It seemed important, and she left it untouched. Using a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat, she cleaned the gash on his side as best she could. The water from her canteen turned pink as she washed away the grit and blood. He flinched in his unconscious state, a low moan escaping his lips. His skin was feverish to the touch. She applied a generous layer of the pine sap and yarrow salve, its medicinal scent filling the small space. It was a poor substitute for a doctor's care, but it was all she had. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the plains in hues of orange and purple, the warrior's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, intense, and filled with a disorientation that quickly hardened into suspicion. He tried to sit up his hand, instinctively going for a knife that was no longer there. "Easy, Abigail," whispered her voice, barely a breath. She held up her empty hands. "You're safe here. I found you in the creek." He stared at her, his gaze sweeping over her simple frock, her sun-browned skin, her determined face. He didn't speak, his jaw tight with pain and mistrust. He was a cornered wolf, wounded, but still dangerous, and she was a lone girl who had willingly walked into his den. The first night had begun, and Abigail Monroe was now the keeper of a secret that could burn her whole world to the ground. The first night was a long vigil, spent in the flickering gloom of a single shielded candle. The Lakota warrior, whose name she didn't know, drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. Abigail forced sips of water between his cracked lips and reapplied cool, damp cloths to his forehead. He spoke only once a single word in his own tongue, a name perhaps repeated in a delirium-fueled rasp Tashunka. He said nothing more, his silence a wall between them, as thick as the log walls of the cabin. By morning, his fever had slightly subsided. His eyes, when they opened to the grey light of dawn, were clear and sharp. He watched her every move, his gaze unwavering, analytical. It was unnerving being observed with such intensity, as if he were memorizing every detail of her face, searching for the lie in her actions. "My name is Abigail." She offered, her voice soft in the quiet of the cabin. She held out a piece of jerky she'd brought from the homestead. "You need to eat." He ignored the food, pushing himself into a sitting position with a grunt of pain. He looked at the clean bandage on his side, then back at her. The question was in his eyes, stark and demanding. "Why you were dying," she said simply, as if that explained everything. To her it did. He finally took the jerky, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact sent a strange warmth through her. He ate slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off her. When he was done, he spoke, his voice low and raspy from disuse. Wanbli Satan, he said. It was not an introduction so much as a statement of fact. Eagle Hawk, Wanbli Satan, she repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables on her tongue. Their communication was sparse, a clumsy dance of gestures and simple words. He pointed to the sky, then made a swooping motion with his hand. Eagle. He tapped his chest. Hawk. She pointed to the babbling creek outside. Whispering Creek. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his dark eyes. A fragile bridge was being built between their two separate worlds, one word at a time. For 2 days, this was their routine. Abigail would sneak away from the farm at dawn and dusk, bringing food, fresh water, and clean bandages. She moved like a ghost, her knowledge of the land her greatest ally. The risk was immense. If her father found out, his anger would be fearsome. If anyone else discovered what she was doing, the consequences would be far worse. The settlers in the nearby town of Providence were already on edge, stirred up by rumors of Lakota raids and the fiery sermons of men who saw Providence in expansion and savagery in anyone who stood in their way. During her time at the cabin, she learned more from his silence than from any words. She saw the way he listened to the world outside his head, cocked his body tense, identifying the call of every bird, the rustle of every unseen creature. He was a part of this land in a way she, a farmer's daughter who worked the soil, could never be. He didn't just live on it. He listened to it. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, her carefully constructed secret began to unravel. Her younger brother Daniel, a boy of 14, with curious eyes and an untamable mop of sandy hair, followed her. He'd grown suspicious of her frequent unexplained absences. He trailed her at a distance, flitting between cottonwoods, his footfalls far louder than he imagined. Abigail sensed him, long before she saw him, a sixth sense, honed by a lifetime of quiet observation. She stopped at the edge of the clearing that housed the cabin and turned. "You can come out, Daniel." He emerged from behind a large boulder, his face a mixture of guilt and excitement. "What are you doing out here?" Abby Pa said this cabin was haunted. "It's not haunted," she said, her voice firm, blocking his view of the cabin door. "I was just exploring. You should go home. I saw you carrying water." "And food," he challenged, his eyes narrowing. "You've been coming here every day. What's inside?" Before she could invent a plausible lie, the cabin door creaked open. Wanbli Satan stood in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. He had found a sturdy branch to use as a crutch. He was weak, but he stood tall, his presence filling the clearing. The eagle feather in his hair seemed to catch the sunlight. Daniel's jaw dropped. All the blood drained from his face, replaced by a pale mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled back, his hand flying to the small skinning knife at his belt. "Get back, Abby," he stammered. It's one of them." Wanbli Satan's eyes were fixed on the boy, not with malice, but with a weary appraisal. He understood the boy's fear. It was a fear he had seen in the eyes of countless white men. "He's hurt," Daniel, Abigail said, stepping between them, placing a calming hand on her brother's arm. "I'm helping him. He means us no harm." "Pa will kill you," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "He'll kill us all. Not if he doesn't find out." She countered, her gaze imploring. "You can't tell him, Daniel. You have to promise me. This man was attacked. He was left for dead. We can't just turn our backs on him." Daniel looked from his sister's determined face to the wounded warrior who watched them with an unnerving stillness. He was caught in a whirlwind of everything he'd been taught, every whispered warning about the savages in the hills, and the undeniable reality of the scene before him, his sister fierce and protective, and a man who looked more wounded than threatening. He swallowed hard his loyalty to Abigail, warring with his fear of his father. "What happened to him?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Abigail looked to Wanbli Setan, who seemed to understand the question. He touched the bandage on his side, then made a gesture with his hands, indicating more than one man. He drew a finger across his own throat. The meaning was chillingly clear. He had been ambushed, and his attackers had meant to finish the job. The raw truth of it settled over Daniel, pushing aside some of his fear. This wasn't a faceless monster from a campfire story. This was a man who had been hunted. "All right, Abby." Daniel finally conceded, his voice low. "I won't tell Pa, but you're crazy. You know that, right?" Abigail let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She had an ally, however reluctant. But as relief washed over her, a new cold dread took its place. The secret was no longer hers alone. It was a fragile thing now held in the hands of a 14-year-old boy. And secrets out here on the unforgiving plains had a terrible way of getting loose. The third night fell with an unsettling stillness. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was muted, the air heavy and expectant. A sliver of a moon, sharp as a shard of bone, offered little light. Inside the Munro farmhouse, the tension was a palpable thing. Silas Munro sat at the head of the table, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, angry strokes. He hadn't said more than 2 words since supper, but his displeasure radiated from him, a cold front that chilled the small room. He knew something was amiss. He didn't know what, but the change in his children, the shared furtive glances and whispered conversations had not escaped his notice. Daniel sat hunched over a book, though his eyes hadn't moved from the page in 10 minutes. Abigail tried to mend a shirt, but her hands trembled slightly, and she pricked her finger more than once. Every distant howl of a coyote made her jump. She was thinking of Wanbli Setan, alone in the dark, his strength slowly returning. She had left him with the last of their salted pork and a full canteen. It had to be enough. The sudden, frantic barking of their dog Patch shattered the quiet. It was not the dog's usual yap at a passing rabbit, but a deep, ferocious volley of warnings. Silas put down his rifle, his movements economical and grim. He grabbed the shotgun leaning by the door. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Both of you." Abigail rushed to the window, her heart pounding. In the faint moonlight she saw them. 3 riders sitting on their horses just beyond the edge of their yard. They weren't soldiers or cowboys. They were shadows, hard men with rifles resting easy in their saddles, their features obscured by the brims of their hats. One of them dismounted, a tall, gaunt man who moved with a predator's lazy grace. Silas stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held loosely at his side, a clear and unambiguous message. "State your business. This is private property." The tall man stopped just short of the porch steps, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. He pushed his hat back, revealing a face of sharp angles and pale, cold eyes. Abigail recognized him instantly. Gideon Crow, a man who worked for Bartholomew Higgins, the wealthiest rancher in the county, a man known for getting what he wanted by any means necessary. Crow was Higgins's shadow, his enforcer. His presence here was a venomous omen. Evening Munro Crow said, his voice a dry rasp. "Just passing through. We're tracking a runaway. A buck. Got himself cut up pretty bad. Figured he might have stumbled this way looking for water." The casual cruelty in his tone, the dehumanizing word, buck, made Abigail's blood run cold. She knew with sickening certainty who they were looking for. "Haven't seen anyone," Silas replied, his voice flat and hard. "Not for days. You're on the wrong scent." Crow smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "Maybe. But my boss, Mr. Higgins, he's offering a reward. a substantial one, for a Lakota carrying a particular item. You see, a man like that, you'd be doing yourself a service to let us know." He let his gaze drift over the small farmhouse, the tidy yard, the look of a man taking inventory of things he could easily break. "If I see a trespasser, the sheriff will be the first to know," Silas said, his knuckles white on the stock of his shotgun. Crow's smile widened. He took a slow, deliberate look at Abigail, who was a silhouette in the window. His pale eyes seemed to pierce the glass to see right through her. It was a look of chilling intimacy, a predator sizing up its prey. A shiver of pure revulsion traced its way down her spine. "You've got a daughter," Crow observed, his voice dropping. "Pretty thing. It's a dangerous world for a girl out here alone. All sorts of things wandering in the dark." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Silas took a half step forward, the barrels of the shotgun rising slightly. "You've stated your business. Now ride on." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the low growl of the dog and the stamping of a restless horse. Then, with a soft chuckle, Crow turned and swung back into his saddle. "Have a good night, Munro," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "We'll be in the area. Keep your eyes open." The three riders wheeled their horses around and melted back into the darkness from which they came. Abigail let out a shuddering breath, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window pane. They were close. So close. They were hunting him, and they wouldn't stop until they found him. Silas came back inside his face, a grim mask. He bolted the door and set the shotgun back in its place, but he didn't return to his chair. He stood in the middle of the room, his shadow long and imposing in the lamplight. "Abigail," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Look at me." She turned from the window, her face pale. She tried to school her features into a mask of innocence, but she knew it was useless. "You're a terrible liar," he said, his voice laced with a weary disappointment. "You always have been. Your hands shake, and you can't meet my eye. You know something about this." "Don't you?" Daniel, who had been frozen in his chair, looked up, his eyes wide with panic. Abigail's mind raced. To lie now would be pointless. He would see right through it. But the truth felt like a betrayal of her own, a condemnation of the man she was trying to save. "Pa," she began, her voice trembling. "Don't you pa me," he cut her off, his voice rising. "Those men are killers. They're hunting someone, and that fear I saw on your face wasn't for us. It was for him. Who is he, Abigail? What have you brought to our doorstep?" The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. The secret she had fought so hoarse to keep in the shadows was about to be dragged kicking and screaming into the unforgiving light of her father's judgment. The silence in the farmhouse was a living entity, thick with accusation and fear. Daniel looked as if he might bolt from his chair and run out into the night. Silas's gaze was fixed on Abigail. His eyes narrowed, demanding the truth she had so desperately tried to conceal. "There's a man," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He was hurt. I found him by the creek. Hurt how Silas pressed his voice like stone. He was stabbed. Left for dead." And Abigail took a deep breath, steeling herself. "He's Lakota." The words landed like a physical blow. Silas recoiled, a look of profound disbelief and anger contorting his features. He stared at her as if she were a stranger, as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue he couldn't comprehend. "You've lost your mind," he said, his voice a low, furious rumble. "Have you completely lost your senses? You brought one of them onto our land. After everything I've told you, after all the stories. He was dying, Pa." She cried, her own voice rising to meet his. What was I supposed to do? Let him bleed to death in the river? Yes, Silas roared, slamming his calloused hand down on the table. The oil lamp flickered wildly, casting frantic shadows across the room. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. That is not our fight. It is not our business. Our business is this farm. It's keeping a roof over our heads and food on this table. It's staying alive. And you have jeopardized all of it for a savage. The word struck Abigail harder than a slap. He is not a savage. He is a man. His name is Wanbli-Sitan, and he was ambushed by those men who were just here, by Gideon Crow. All the more reason to have stayed away. Silas shot back, pacing the length of the small room like a caged animal. Crow works for Bartholomew Higgins. Do you have any idea what that man is capable of? Higgins wants the land north of the creek, the land the treaty guarantees to the Lakota. He has been trying to provoke an incident for months, something that will bring the army down on them and break the treaty for good. And you, my daughter, have just handed him that incident on a silver platter. He rounded on her, his face inches from hers. "Where is he?" he demanded. "Where are you hiding him?" Abigail stood her ground, her chin held high, though her heart was hammering. "I won't tell you. Abigail, so help me God." "What would you do?" she challenged, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "Would you turn him over to Crow? Let them murder him? Is that the kind of man you are?" The question stopped him short. For a moment, the fury in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of pained conflict. Silas Munro was a hard man, a fearful man, but he was not a murderer. He was a farmer, a builder. His hands were made for fixing and growing, not for taking a life or delivering a man to his executioners. Daniel, seeing his father's hesitation, finally found his voice. "He's in the old trapper's cabin," he blurted out, then immediately shrank back as both his father and sister turned their gazes on him. Silas closed his eyes, a deep, weary sigh escaping his lips. He ran a hand over his face, the anger draining out of him, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. "The trapper's cabin?" he repeated, his voice hollow. He looked at Abigail, and for the first time she saw not anger, but a desperate, bone-deep fear. "Abby, you don't understand," he said, his voice softening, pleading. "This isn't about one man. If Crow finds him on our land, or even near it, he'll claim we're aiding to them. He'll tell Higgins. They could burn us out. They could brand us as traitors. We would lose everything. Everything your mother and I worked our whole lives to build. Our lives are worth more than the farm Abigail insisted." "Are they?" he asked, a bitter edge to his voice. "Out here the land is all we have. It's the only thing that separates us from starvation and dust. I will not lose it. Not for you, not for anyone." He walked to the door and picked up his rifle. "At first light, I'm going to that cabin. You will come with me. You will tell this man that he has to leave. He has to be gone from this land, or I will take this rifle and I will make him go." It was not a threat of violence against Wanbli-Sitan, but a promise of force. A final desperate act of self-preservation. "No," Abigail said, her voice quiet but unyielding. Silas turned incredulous. "What did you say?" I said. "No. He's not strong enough to travel yet. Those men are out there hunting him. Sending him out there now would be a death sentence, and you know it. I won't be a part of it." It was the first time in her life she had truly defied him. She had argued, she had complained, but she had never looked her father in the eye and refused a direct order. The line had been drawn. On one side stood Silas, governed by his fear and his fierce protective love for his family and his land. On the other stood Abigail, guided by a conviction that was as new as it was powerful, a belief that some things were more important than safety. "Then you are as much a fool as I feared," Silas said, his voice heavy with sorrow and defeat. "When they come, and they will come, don't say I didn't warn you." He turned his back on her, the conversation over. Abigail stood alone in the center of the room, the weight of her decision settling upon her. She had saved a man's life, but in doing so, she may have just condemned her entire family. The riders were out there in the darkness, and the fragile peace of the Monroe homestead had been shattered for good. The dawn broke grey and joyless, the air holding a damp chill that promised a change in the weather. A silent, agonizingly tense breakfast passed at the Monroe farm. Silas ate without looking at either of his children, his jaw set in a stubborn line. Daniel picked at his food, casting worried glances between his father and sister. Only Abigail seemed to possess a calm, albeit a fragile one. Her decision during the night had settled within her, solidifying from a reckless impulse into a core of unshakable resolve. As soon as the meal was over, she slipped out of the house with a bundle of bread cheese and a fresh roll of linen bandages. She didn't look back to see if her father was watching. She knew he was. When she reached the clearing, Wanbli-Katan was outside the cabin, studying the ground. He had fashioned a crude spear from a sharpened branch and moved with a noticeable limp, but the feverish weakness was gone, replaced by a coiled, watchful energy. He looked up as she approached, his eyes immediately scanning the trees behind her, searching for threats. "Just me," she said softly. He nodded, his gaze returning to her. He seemed to know that something had changed. The fear she carried was no longer just for him. It was a heavier, more complex burden. "My father knows," she said, handing him the food. "And the men who are hunting you, they came to our farm last night. They are close." Wanbli-Katan took the bread, his expression unreadable. He broke off a piece and ate, his eyes never leaving her face. After a moment, he spoke. "Gideon Crow." Abigail's eyes widened. "You know him. He works for a man who wants to steal the earth from beneath our feet." Wanbli-Katan said, his English slow but clear. He had spoken little of it before, but the direct threat seemed to loosen his tongue. "They want the land by the shining river. The ground there is sacred to my people. It is where we find the painted stones. It is protected by the white man's paper. The treaty." He paused, touching the small leather pouch at his belt, the one she had noticed when she first found him. He worked the intricate knots loose with his strong fingers and carefully unwrapped the hide. Inside, nestled in a bed of sage and soft rabbit fur, was a cylindrical object of smooth, polished stone. It was heavy dark and marked with a series of carved symbols and a single starkly etched number. "This is a treaty marker," he explained, his voice low with reverence. "One of many placed by our grandfathers and the soldiers long ago to mark the boundaries of our land. This one was pulled from the ground at the shining river. Higgins's men took it. Proof that they do not honor the paper. Proof that they trespass." He looked down at the gash in his side. "I took it back. They want it, and they want me silenced." The full weight of the situation crashed down on Abigail. This wasn't just about a random act of violence. Wanbli-Katan wasn't merely a victim. He was a guardian, a warrior carrying the physical proof of a crime. The small, heavy stone in his hands was more than just a marker. It was a symbol of his people's rights, a legal and spiritual anchor to the land they called home. Higgins and Crow weren't just hunting a man. They were trying to bury the truth. "We have to get you away from here," Abigail said, her mind racing. "They will search this area. They know you are wounded. They will look for any sign." "Your father. He wants me gone," Juan Blisetan stated. It wasn't a question. He had likely heard the argument from the night before, carried on the wind, or perhaps he just understood the nature of fear. My father is afraid, she confirmed. He thinks he is protecting us, but he is wrong. We can't just send you out there to die. A plan, desperate and uncertain, began to form in her mind. There's a place, a series of caves in the bluffs to the north. My brother and I used to play there as children. It's hard to find if you don't know the way. The entrance is hidden behind a waterfall. You could hide there. Rest. Wait for your people. Juan Blisetan considered her words, his gaze distant. He looked at the treaty marker in his hands, then at the vast open prairie that surrounded them. He was a man of open spaces, of sky and wind. Hiding in a cave was the act of a fox, not a wolf. But he was wounded, and the hunters were circling. This land, he said, gesturing to the trees and the creek it speaks. If you listen. He walked to the edge of the creek, kneeling down, despite the pain in his side. He pointed to the soft mud of the bank. Crow will look for tracks. A man on foot, wounded, makes a heavy trail. He looked up at her, a new light in his eyes. The water hides a trail. It washes the scent. We will walk in the creek. It will be slow, but it will leave no sign for them to follow. It was a brilliant and simple idea. The Whispering Creek flowed north in the same direction as the bluffs. It would be cold and arduous, but it was their best chance. My brother Daniel, he can help, Abigail said. He knows the woods as well as I do. He can create a false trail leading them south towards the Badlands. It will buy us time. It was a risk putting her brother in harm's way, but Daniel was quick and clever. And after the confrontation with their father, she sensed a change in him, a desire to stand with her, to do what was right, not just what was safe. Juan Blisetan nodded slowly a silent agreement. He carefully rewrapped the treaty marker and secured it to his belt. He looked at Abigail, and for the first time, she saw something other than pain or suspicion in his eyes. It was respect, acknowledgement. They were no longer a white girl and a Lakota warrior. They were allies, bound by a shared secret and a common enemy. We must go now, he said, his voice firm. Before the sun is high, the hunter's moon has passed. The wolf's moon is coming. He didn't have to explain. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. The time for running had begun. Leaving the relative safety of the trapper's cabin felt like stepping off a cliff into thin air. The plan was set in motion with a desperate whispered conversation between Abigail and Daniel by the woodpile. To her surprise, her brother agreed without hesitation. The sight of Gideon Crow's cruel face and the raw fear he'd seen in his father's eyes had forged a new resolve in the boy. He would take one of their older horses, one with a distinctive gait, and lead it south, creating a set of tracks for Crow's men to find a trail that would lead them on a wild goose chase into the rocky, unforgiving Badlands. Be careful, Daniel, Abigail pleaded, gripping his arm. They'll be looking for a man on foot, not a boy on a horse, he said, puffing out his chest with a bravery he didn't quite feel. I'll be fine, Abby. Just, you be careful too. As Daniel slipped away towards the south, Abigail and Juan Blisetan entered the frigid waters of the Whispering Creek. The shock of the cold stole Abigail's breath, seeping through her boots and the hem of her dress. For Juan Blisetan, every step was a careful, pain-filled negotiation. He leaned heavily on his makeshift spear, his face a stoic mask that betrayed none of the agony his wound must have been causing him. They moved slowly, hugging the deepest part of the channel, where the current flowed strongest, washing away any mud or silt they stirred up. The cottonwoods and willows that lined the banks provided cover their branches, draping low over the water like a verdant curtain. It was painstaking progress. The world was reduced to the sound of gurgling water, the sight of the sun dappling through the leaves and the constant biting cold. Hours bled into one another. Abigail's initial fear began to dull, replaced by a grim determination. They communicated with hand signals and hushed whispers, pointing out slick rocks and deeper pools. A strange sort of partnership formed between them in the flowing water, a silent understanding of shared purpose and shared risk. It was late in the afternoon when they heard it, the distant sound of shod horses moving through the trees on the west bank. Not the steady rhythmic pace of travelers, but the stop-and-start movement of trackers searching for a trail. Instinctively, Wanbli-Titan pulled Abigail toward the bank, into the deep shadow of an undercut ledge overgrown with roots and hanging moss. They pressed themselves against the cold, damp earth, the water swirling around their waists. They were completely concealed from above. Abigail held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. They heard voices, rough and impatient. Gideon Crow's dry rasp cut through the air. He was here. The track's end at the creek. He went in the water. "Could have gone either way, boss," another voice said. "He's wounded," Crow snapped. "He won't have gone upstream. Too hard. He'd go with the current. Head south. Spread out. Check the banks. Look for any sign of him coming out of the water. I want him found before nightfall." The sounds of the horses receded as the men moved south, following the false trail Daniel was hopefully miles ahead of creating. Abigail let out a breath she hadn't known. She was holding her body trembling with cold and residual fear. Wanbli-Titan remained perfectly still for a long moment, listening before giving a slight nod. They were safe for now. Crow's arrogance, his assumption that a wounded man would take the easy path, had been his mistake. They continued their slow, arduous journey north. By the time the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape, the terrain had changed. The gentle roll of the prairie gave way to rising bluffs of grey rock and pine. The creek grew narrower and faster, cascading over stones. Finally, Abigail saw the landmark she had been searching for, a twisted, lightning-scarred pine tree on the eastern bluff. "We're close," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "The waterfall is just around this bend." The waterfall wasn't large, but it was a steady curtain of white water, spilling from a higher ledge into a deep, clear pool. Behind it, almost perfectly obscured, was a dark opening in the rock face. This was their sanctuary. With the last of their strength, they climbed out of the creek and scrambled up the slick rocks. Pushing through the cold spray of the falls was like passing through a veil into another world. The cave was shallow at first, but opened into a larger chamber, dry and sheltered from the wind. It smelled of damp stone and ancient earth. They collapsed onto the sandy floor, utterly spent. The adrenaline that had sustained them for hours drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the pervasive biting cold of their water-soaked clothes. Wanbli-Titan leaned against the rock wall, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. The trek had taken a severe toll on him. Abigail knew they needed a fire, but the smoke would be a beacon to anyone searching the area. As darkness consumed the cave entrance, the temperature plummeted. She huddled for warmth, her body shaking uncontrollably. After a while, Wanbli-Titan stirred. He looked at her shivering form and blue-tinged lips. Without a word, he shifted closer, moving with painful effort, and draped a part of his still damp blanket over her shoulders. He sat beside her, his back against the rock, his solid presence a bulwark against the encroaching dark. They sat in silence, sharing a sliver of warmth, two fugitives hidden behind a wall of water. Then a new sound reached them over the constant roar of the falls, a sound that made Abigail's blood freeze in her veins, the baying of a hound. It was distant at first, but it was unmistakable, and it was getting closer. Crow hadn't been fooled for long. He had dogs. They had followed a scent the men couldn't see, a scent the water hadn't been able to wash away completely. The coyotes had found their den. The encirclement was complete. The relentless sound of the hound drew nearer, a death knell echoing through the bluffs. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Abigail. They were trapped. The cave had a single entrance, and it was about to be guarded. All their effort, the cold journey up the creek. Daniel's risky diversion, it was all for nothing. Wanbli-Setan pushed himself to his feet, his face grim in the deepening twilight. He held the sharpened spear, a pitiful defense against rifles and dogs, but he held it as if it were an extension of his own will. He would not be taken easily. He scanned the dark interior of the cave, his eyes searching not for an escape route, but for an advantage. The back, he said his voice, a low command. "Is there another way?" "No," Abigail said, her voice shaking. "It's a dead end. The chamber just gets smaller." He ignored her, limping towards the rear of the cave. He ran his hands along the rock wall, his touch surprisingly gentle, as if he were reading a story written in stone. Abigail watched him, confused her mind, consumed by the sound of the approaching dog. Here he grunted his fingers, finding a small fissure near the floor, a crack from which a faint, cool draught emanated. The stone breathes. He pressed his ear to the rock, listening. Abigail could hear nothing but the waterfall and the dog, but he heard something else. He began to pull and pry at the loose rocks around the fissure. Abigail, shaking off her paralysis, rushed to help. Their fingers, numb with cold, scrabbled at the stone, pulling away smaller rocks and packed earth. The opening was small, barely wide enough for a child to crawl through. It led into a narrow, suffocating darkness. "It's a bolt hole," Abigail breathed a flicker of hope, igniting within her. The trapper who used this cave must have made it. "Go," Wanbli-Setan urged, pushing her towards the opening. "Now." The sound of men's voices joined the barking. They were at the pool below the waterfall. "She's in there." It was Crow's voice, triumphant and cruel. "The dog has the scent. Bottle them up. Nobody goes in or out till sunrise." Abigail squeezed through the tight opening, the rough stone scraping her shoulders. She found herself in a narrow lava tube, a natural tunnel that sloped steeply upwards into utter blackness. Wanbli-Setan followed his broader frame, barely fitting. The passage was agonizing for him, his wounded side scraping against the rock. He pulled a large flat stone into place behind them, blocking the entrance. It wouldn't hold against a determined search, but it would hide the opening in the dark. They were plunged into a terrifying, absolute blackness. The air was stale and cold. Abigail could hear Wanbli-Setan's ragged breathing just behind her. She fought back a wave of claustrophobia, forcing herself to move, to crawl upwards on her hands and knees, into the unknown. The passage twisted and turned a claustrophobic eternity of rough stone and suffocating dark. Just when Abigail felt her hope begin to fail, she saw it a faint grey luminescence ahead. A patch of stars visible through a tangle of roots and rock. An exit. They emerged gasping into the cold night air through a small opening on top of the bluff, hidden in a thicket of overgrown juniper bushes. Below them, they could see the flicker of a campfire near the waterfall. Crow and his men had settled in for a siege, confident their prey was trapped. They didn't linger. Using the North Star as his guide, Wanbli-Setan led them away from the bluffs, moving through the darkness with an assurance that amazed her. He seemed to read the land with his feet, avoiding loose rocks and thorny brush. His strength was failing, but his spirit was indomitable. They walked until the moon set, and the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft grey. They found shelter in a small rocky depression as the sun rose on a world washed clean and new. Wanbli Setan finally allowed himself to rest, slumping against a boulder, his face pale with exhaustion and pain. Abigail sat beside him, watching the vast expanse of the prairie come to life. Her family, her farm, her entire world felt a lifetime away. She was an outcast, a fugitive, but she felt no regret. "They will go back to your home," Wanbli Setan said, his voice quiet. "I know," she replied. "My father, he will tell them we ran off. He will lie for us. He is afraid, but he is a good man." She hoped it was true. "You have a warrior's heart, Abigail Monroe," he said, looking at her. The respect in his eyes was a powerful, warming thing. "My people will not forget what you have done." He reached for the hide-wrapped bundle at his belt. "I must go on alone from here. My camp is a day's journey to the north. I can make it." He held out the heavy treaty marker to her. "This is too great a risk for you to carry. If they find it on you—" Abigail looked at the stone at the symbols that held the fate of a people. She shook her head. "No. You are still weak. I will go with you. I will help you carry this. It is my burden now, too." A slow smile touched Wanbli Setan's lips, a rare sight that transformed his stern features. It was a smile of acceptance, of a bond forged in water and darkness. "Then let us walk," he said. They rose together and set their faces to the north. Behind them the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the night's shadows. They were two small figures in a vast, indifferent landscape, a farm girl and a Lakota warrior walking toward an uncertain future. They had not won a war, nor defeated their enemies. Gideon Crow and Bartholomew Higgins were still out there, their greed a poison on the land. But Abigail and Wanbli Setan had survived the night. They had kept the truth safe. And as they walked on into the dawning light of a different horizon, they carried with them the small, defiant hope that it would be enough. What you just heard isn't just a story of the Old West. It's a story about the choices that define us. When faced with injustice, do we choose safety, or do we choose what is right? Abigail Monroe, a simple farm girl, made her choice by the banks of a lonely creek, and in doing so, altered the course of her life forever. Her story reminds us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. It's a testament to the fact that true strength often comes from quiet compassion, and that alliances can be forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. If this story of bravery, survival, and defiance resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a tale of the untamed frontier, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring history to life. What would you have done in Abigail's position? Let us know in the comments below.